So, what do I want you to know about Notes and speaking of courage? Well, what Tim O'Brien says happened in Notes, it both did and it didn't. According to Notes, Norman had read O'Brien's first book, If I Die in a Combat Zone, which is a real book, and he suggested Tim write a story about a guy who has nowhere to go after the war. According to Notes, O'Brien was working on a book called Going After Cacciato, and wrote Speaking of Courage as a potential chapter and hoped to use the lake from his hometown in Minnesota as a natural counterpoint. As a nucleus around which the story could orbit. Remember that Norman Bowker, when he drives around the lake and Speaking of Courage, his car is going clockwise, as if in orbit. Anyway, O'Brien published the story quickly as a separate short story, and when Norman read it, he was disappointed because Tim had left out the field from Vietnam and Kiowa's death, things O'Brien left out because he wanted that story to better fit with the novel's narrative. Also, according to Notes, after Norman's death, Tim restored the killing power of the field to the piece. He restored Kiowa's death. He even included Norman Bowker's real name. All of that gets published as Speaking of Courage in a short story form, but also in the book. So here's the deal. This is both true and untrue. Norman, you must remember, is a fictional character. So O'Brien here gives a fictional character credit for making the recommendation, but also for having read his first book and having been disappointed and come up with some suggestions. That said, the books named by O'Brien here are real books. Tim O'Brien did write If I Die in a Combat Zone. He also did write Going After Cacciato. In fact, Speaking of Courage was published as a separate short story when O'Brien was working on Going After Cacciato, and a version of that separate story does appear in Going After Cacciato. The version published separately is called Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy? And it's very much what Norman describes. Most importantly, in Charming Billy, O'Brien loses the natural counterpoint between the lake and the field. So here's your task. Consider what the natural counterpoints are between the lake and the field. Here are a few obvious ones. The boys with the toy rifles and the fireworks that Norman sees likely approximate things Norman would have seen in Vietnam. In addition, if you're interested, read Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy, and examine it for a whiff of Speaking of Courage and the truth of Bowker's criticism.